A young woman murdered in cold blood.
The reaction in the town was, we must find who did this.
I guess I know who killed that nurse, Gail Miller.
A teenager is accused and sent to jail.
I didn't do it.
For decades, pleas of innocence are ignored.
You can't give up hope.
The case captivates a nation and reaches the highest court in the land. Clues are found in long overlooked evidence. Can breakthroughs in forensic science get the real killer off the street? This dramatic reconstruction is based on eyewitness accounts, police evidence, and court records. Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, January 31st, 1969. A bitter morning on the Canadian prairie begins with a grisly discovery. A schoolgirl finds a body dumped in a snowbank. A small city is faced with a savage murder.
Saskatoon in 1969, the era of flower power and hippies, was an incredibly conservative, very small city. So a murder would be a big event.
Female, late teens, early 20s maybe.
Police are on the scene quickly. The victim has been stabbed more than a dozen times. There are wounds in her throat, chest, and stomach. Her underwear is torn. It appears that she's been raped.
There's a lot of blood. It's like a knife blade here.
Half buried in the snow, police find what may be the murder weapon. But the handle and any fingerprints it might have had can't be found.
Got the guys checking the perimeter, so maybe you can check in with them, see what you can find.
Yeah, okay.
Detective?
Keys are discovered nearby, and a small comb.
Hey, Carla, looks like a purse here.
An empty purse is found in the trash can.
In terms of concrete objects, the police really didn't have much in the way of forensic evidence. It was -42, so there were no fingerprints. There was blood at the scene, but forensically there wasn't much to go on.
There is one vital clue. A name tag found on the body identifies the victim as Gail Miller. Peter Carlisle Gorge has followed the Miller case for decades.
Gail Miller was a young woman, 20 years old. She grew up in a small town in Saskatchewan. She always liked children and wanted eventually to work with babies. So her grandmother helped her to move to Saskatoon so she could train to be a nurse's aide at the city hospital.
The murder of Gail Miller makes front-page news.
The reaction in the town was, we must find who did this. It's horrendous. And a great atmosphere of fear. So there was enormous pressure on the police force to find who did this.
Police found all but one of the bodies in their beds at the Peterson home, bludgeoned to death with an axe as they slept.
The attack on Miller was just the latest in a series of unsettling crimes in Saskatchewan. The night before her murder, 7 people had been butchered to death in a town nearby. And Saskatoon itself is haunted by a series of unsolved rapes.
There were a number of sexual assaults that had occurred in Saskatoon earlier in the fall of 1968. The police were interested in whether or not the person responsible had anything to do with the Miller murder.
Got the guys checking the
Miller was living in a rooming house, close to where her body was found. Detectives talked to her neighbors, hoping to learn more about what happened that morning.
We're investigating the murder of Gail Miller.
Okay.
And we need to ask you a few questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
Did you know Miss Miller?
One of the neighbors worked at the same hospital. She saw Miller leave the house early in the morning.
But what time was that at?
About 6:45. I think she catch the 7 a.m. bus.
The neighbor also tells the police that the rapes in the city had made Miller uneasy.
Gail Miller had told her friend that she was training with at the hospital that she had specific concerns about walking to the bus stop in the dark and about strange men and maybe being attacked.
See, the way I see it, she's got to get from her place to the bus stop.
Miller's body was found in an alley between the rooming house and the bus stop. Her comb, keys, and other items were found nearby. It seems likely that she was dragged into the alley shortly after she left her room. But there's still very little evidence for police to work with. Police go door to door, hoping to find an eyewitness to the crime. They also ask for help from people who took the same bus Miller did.
Happen to recognize his face? No.
But they don't have any luck.
They asked as many questions as they could. They appealed in the newspapers if anybody had seen anything to contact them.
First.
One of the dozens of tips police get is particularly alarming.
Yes.
A woman says she was attacked in the same neighborhood just before Miller was killed. A woman who almost 30 years later still wants to remain anonymous.
I left my parents' home and was walking towards the bus stop, and I realized at some point that somebody was walking toward me. He reached out and did what we called a nosedive, just felt me up my thigh and did a grope. And I think my automatic response at that point was to scream. So I just threw my books up in the air and my lunch up in the air. And I think that maybe have been what scared him, I don't know, because when I looked up, he was gone.
This attack occurred about 7 a.m. on January 31st, likely moments before Miller was killed. Perhaps a serial rapist, his rage building, had targeted Miller.
The RCMP had been asked by the Saskatoon police to look at whether the circumstances of the murder were consistent with the rapes. And the RCMP concluded that they were.
The police of Saskatoon may have a monster on their hands.
There's the cone further north up by this tree.
The results of Gail Miller's autopsy are grim. Injuries to her body confirm that she's been sexually assaulted. And there are traces of semen on her uniform, but they're no help in identifying her killer.
Inconclusive.
Of course, the technology in 1969 did not allow the police to do what they can now, which is perform DNA testing and get a DNA profile.
A closer look at Miller's clothing reveals something peculiar. While there are stab wounds through her coat, there are no holes in her nursing uniform. How had she been stabbed more than a dozen times without her uniform being damaged? Looking for something they may have missed, police return to the scene of the crime and get lucky. Overlooked the first time, they find a new piece of evidence. When the samples are tested, police discover that it's semen. More importantly, there are traces of blood mixed with it. While DNA profiling is still years in the future, the blood will allow them to narrow their hunt down. The killer of Gail Miller will likely have the same blood type as that found near her body.
They did a lot of groundwork, footwork. They really didn't have a lot to go on. They had no suspect.
Desperate to solve the case, police offer a $2,000 reward to dig up any new clues. As the days pass, the handle of the murder weapon is found and turned in. But the frigid winter has destroyed any evidence. No fingerprints can be recovered. Miller's wallet is also found, but it doesn't offer up any clues either. Then, a month after the murder, a local teenager enters the Saskatoon police station. He insists on talking to someone in charge of the Gail Miller murder.
We're all ears. Have a seat.
I guess I know who did it. You know, who killed that nurse? Gail Miller?
Albert Cadrain, who is nicknamed Shorty, lives in the neighborhood where the young nurse's aide was killed. He gives police a suspect and a story.
David Milgard's a friend of mine. I shouldn't say friend yet. I've only known him a couple years, not really.
He believes that his friend, David Milgard, may be the killer.
Showed up in a car with friends. I've never seen these friends before.
Cadrain tells police that on the morning of the murder, Milgard showed up unannounced at his house with a strange request.
Hey man, you mind if I come in and change my pants?
He had blood on his pants.
David Milgard is only 16, but he's already a confirmed hippie. Milgard has just arrived in town with two friends. They hope to convince Shorty to join them on a road trip.
So I said, yeah, come inside.
Ron Wilson is another member of Milgard's group. He's a juvenile delinquent who's recently served time for possession of heroin. Nicole John is the third person in the car.
So he changed his pants and he really wanted to hit the road. He wanted to hit the road really, really fast.
Cadrain tells police he agreed to join the three with the vague plan of driving to the West Coast, hoping to find cheap drugs.
So we got in the car, he introduced me to his friends, Nicole and Ron Wilson. We headed west.
On the road, Cadrain says that Milgard's behavior became even stranger.
He started acting weird.
Weird how?
He said, I want to get rid of them. He said they knew too much.
It was very difficult for the police to come up with anything concrete in the first month. And it wasn't until Albert Cadrain went down to the police station to volunteer a statement, casting suspicion at least on David Milgard, that the police had their first concrete lead.
The critical thing is where Cadrain lived, 1 block from where the body was found. The very house that David Milgard visited that day. And items belonging to Gail Miller, including a wallet, were found very close to the house.
I've seen this in my head. It's a sign.
Cadrain also tells police he's had visions of Milgard as the killer.
So what are you saying? Milgard's evil?
Sure, yeah.
It's a disturbing tip. But to put any faith in what Cadrain says, police need to get his story confirmed.
What do you make of that?
I think it's something we can use.
Police track down David Milgard's friend, Ron Wilson.
So Ronald, I think you know why you're here. We need the story from you.
Wilson says that the idea for the road trip started after Milgard stole an old car battery. It allowed them to start the car.
Drive off. On our way to Saskatoon.
On the day of the murder, the three friends left their hometown in Regina around midnight and drove for 7 hours to get to Saskatoon. They were high on drugs as they drove. During the trip, Wilson noticed that Milgard had a knife.
And the guy was carving an apple with a knife.
There's a knife in the car. What kind of knife?
On the morning of the murder, they arrived in Saskatoon and couldn't find Cadrain's house. They asked a woman for directions.
Hey, you know where Pleasant Hill is?
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
Hey, come on in, we'll give you a lift.
No, that's okay. Thanks.
Wilson tells police that he tried turning around shortly after, but his car broke down.
They couldn't move the car, so both David and he left the car, but they went to look for help and left Nicole parked in the car, stuck at this intersection.
So I get out of the car, he goes one way, I go the other way, Nicole stays in the car.
You guys split up?
Yeah, we split up. Came back to the car for like 5 minutes later, and Nicole's freaking out over nothing. I don't even know.
What's the matter? Hello?
Wilson tries to calm Nicole down, but can't. A few minutes later, Milgard returns.
Hello? Nick. Any luck?
Fixed her.
What?
Just drive out of here. He said he fixed her.
Fixed her. Fixed who?
I don't know.
You don't know. He comes back to the car, you guys are separated, he says, I fixed her, and you don't ask him who she is.
We were high, man. I don't know what the hell was going on. He came in the car and said he fixed her.
Ron tries the car again. This time, it starts. 2 months after the murder, police track down Nicole John in Regina.
You want to just tell us a little bit about what happened that day when you got to Saskatoon?
Are you afraid of David Milgard?
A little.
When they question her, she backs up Wilson's account of what happened. Nicole tells police that after the two men left for help, she saw Milgard approach the woman they had just talked to.
I saw David stab her. He grabbed her and he pulled her into the dark.
Nicole then tells police that when Milgard returned to the car, he was eager to leave.
Just drive out of here.
This was direct evidence implicating David Milgard in the murder of Gail Miller.
So are you saying your three friends are lying to us?
I'm saying I didn't do it.
When police question him, Milgard denies everything and offers a blood sample to prove his innocence. The blood is tested. It's type A, the same type as the blood found in the semen near Miller's body. It's a breakthrough for police. They now have a theory of exactly what happened. Milgard left the car hoping to catch up with the pretty girl he had just talked to. Looking for money to fix the car or buy drugs, he tries to steal her purse. When she resists, the robbery gets violent. Milgard drags Miller into the alleyway and rapes her. Then he stabs her to protect his identity. When he's finished, he grabs her wallet and dumps the purse in a garbage can. Another piece of the puzzle falls into place. Miller's wallet wasn't found near the body, but near Cadrain's house. Milgard admits to police that he did briefly step outside Shorty's house alone. It would have given him a chance to get rid of Gail Miller's wallet. Police are convinced.
Now we know the killer's route, and it's the same as Milgard's.
5 months after her brutal killing, police charge David Milgard with the murder of Gail Miller.
Milgard was taken into custody this forenoon in Prince George, British Columbia by the RCM police. He will be returned to Saskatoon under RCM police escort as soon as arrangements can be made, and he will appear in local Saskatoon court as soon thereafter as possible.
When Milgard's trial begins, the Crown calls dozens of witnesses. They include Shorty Cadrain, Ron Wilson, and Nicole John. Milgard doesn't take the stand and sticks to his plea of not guilty. January 31st, 1970, exactly 1 year after Gail Miller's brutal slaying, David Milgard is convicted of murder.
He was sentenced to life in prison, which could back then mean life. His mother burst into tears. His father, who had always been the strong man to lean on, just let out a soul-wrenching groan and tried to stay strong, but it was catastrophic.
But for Milgard, the conviction isn't the end of the story. From prison, he maintains his innocence.
Mom, I didn't do it. Get me out of here.
Milgard insists that his so-called friends are lying and that he never committed the murder. His mother, Joyce Milgard, makes it her mission to prove her son's innocence.
I will get you out of here.
Joyce just struck me as a force of nature. She's a person who feels things very passionately, but she's also extremely intelligent. Obviously, there was an awful murder. Obviously, someone did it. It just wasn't her son.
It's the beginning of an odyssey through the justice system. The family hopes that the normal appeals process will clear David, but they get nowhere. 10 years slip by.
The Milgards tried the usual appeal processes and nothing happened. The problem was simple. Since he claimed he never committed the murder, he showed no remorse, and the parole board consistently refused to hear anything about halfway houses or getting out of prison.
Then in 1980, a decade after being sent to jail, David Milgard escapes from prison. For more than 2 months, police search for him. When he's spotted in Toronto, he runs and is shot before being captured. For Milgard's mother, it's the last straw.
Joyce Milgard decided they had to do something. They couldn't rely just on the system going its sweet way and taking forever.
You can't give up hope.
She travels 1,000 miles to Saskatoon and hands out reward notices in the neighborhood where Miller was killed. She hopes someone will come forward with new evidence.
Thank you.
Next, she seeks out one of the country's top defense lawyers, Hirsch Walsh, to take on her son's case.
I'd like you to consider looking at some of the evidence that was presented at my son's trial.
She wasn't your typical, if there is a typical mother of somebody convicted of murder. Joyce was very businesslike. It was on merit that she wanted her son's case looked at, not on emotion. She had a box or two of material that she had collected, which also impressed me.
I'd like one of my associates to hear you out, okay?
Walsh enlists his assistant, David Asper, to help with the case.
I became directly involved because I was essentially the low man on the totem pole in the law firm. And I went through the material, and it struck me very early on that nothing about the case made any sense. It looked like a pile of nonsense.
Asper notices that there are dozens of witnesses in the case, but that the most damning testimony came from Milgard's so-called friends.
The thing that really stood out for me was that every credible witness, every regular, normal citizen of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan that morning who encountered David Milgard gave evidence that would suggest that nothing had happened. And it was only the unsavory and the people with something to gain witnesses who implicated Milgard. And that was clear right from the first reading of the transcript.
Then Asper makes a startling discovery. Acting on a hunch, he visits the courthouse where the trial took place 16 years earlier. In the basement, he discovers that the original physical evidence has been preserved.
That wasn't quite normal to keep exhibits that long, being the victim's clothing, etc. We later found out it was kept because the prosecutor wanted to write a book about his victory, and he was going to include the exhibits and photographs and things like that, so it was more of an ego trip that caused the exhibits to be kept.
By 1989, the physical evidence from the crime scene that helped convict Milgard can now be tested. At the time, DNA fingerprinting is a revolutionary new forensic tool. The Milgard team has high hopes that this new technique will set David free. It's just part of a comprehensive re-examination of all the original evidence, from blood samples to crime scene exhibits. Dr. James Ferris studies the DNA samples found on Gail Miller's clothing. Unfortunately for the Milgard team, the first reports are not encouraging.
Dr. Ferris said, we can't get DNA. Wasn't enough sample or whatever. The science at that time didn't allow it.
But Ferris believes that there's other evidence from the day of the murder that just doesn't add up. Evidence which supports the idea that David Milgard is not the killer. The entry marks on the victim's coat indicate that the killer was right-handed, but Milgard is left-handed. And the angle of the knife wound suggests that the killer was below average height. Milgard is above average. A theory develops that explains why Miller's coat had marks from the knife, but her uniform didn't. The temperature on the day of the attack was a bone-chilling -42 degrees. Bare skin would freeze almost instantly if exposed.
I've spoken to physicians and asked if it's possible to rape a woman at -42 degrees. They all said no, wouldn't happen.
Ferris believes that in that kind of weather, Miller's rape likely happened inside a building or a car, and that her nurse's uniform was pulled down during the assault. The forensic expert believes Miller escaped from a car where the assault took place with her uniform still in disarray. She pulled her coat on, but was chased down and killed. But Ron Wilson's car had broken down, and there were witnesses inside. There was nowhere for Milgard to rape Miller. And if he had attacked her in the street, the stab wounds would have ripped through her uniform too.
The stabbing through the coat and not through the dress made no sense.
Buoyed by the doubts raised by the evidence, the Milgard team decides to hire private investigator Paul Henderson. He tracks down the witnesses whose testimony in 1970 was so devastating.
Hey, Ron Wilson?
We learned that Ron Wilson was working in a tire shop in a small mountain town in British Columbia.
For 2 decades, Milgard has never understood why his friends turned against him. Finally, Paul Henderson finds out.
David didn't do a thing. So, what you told the cops?
Well, I told the cops what they told me, basically.
Wilson told me, in essence, that police told him if he didn't cooperate with them, they were going to pin this case on him, and he was going to go down with David Milgard. He didn't have a chance of standing up to these cops.
So why don't you tell me which one's the murder weapon?
Wilson claims he gave police the answers that they wanted.
The one on the left.
It's a good choice, Ronald.
I was coarse, man. I had 2 guys breathing down my neck.
And one other mystery is solved. The alleged blood stains on Milgard are revealed to be acid stains from the car battery that Milgard stole the night before.
He had a lot of guilt on his mind. I felt badly for him.
Shorty Cadrain is the next witness Henderson tracks down. His tip was the one that pointed police at Milgard in the first place. 20 years later, Henderson finds that Cadrain is a troubled man.
When I first met him, he was living in a treehouse in his brother's backyard. His brother told me that he was a mental case and that he had no business and used as a witness in a court of law.
He had blood on his pants.
What we learned in due course about Cadrain was that he was quite an ill young man who was committed to psychiatric institution shortly after the Milgard conviction. He was a schizophrenic and had suffered significant delusions.
I've seen this in my head. It's a sign.
In 1969, police were faced with a lack of credible suspects and were under pressure to solve the case.
So what are you saying? Milgard's evil?
Sure. Sure, yeah.
They overlooked Cadrain's mental instability and pursued his tip aggressively.
He started to open up to me and eventually told me that he, like Wilson, had been browbeaten by these cops.
The police were very focused, and Shorty Cadrain, when he went in and implicated Milgard for the first time, triggered something called tunnel vision and went off on a wild goose chase that wound up fabricating a case against Milgard.
Milgard's team learns that Nicole John also felt tremendous pressure from police. In fact, police left her and Shorty Cadrain in the same room. After that, she told police that she also had suspicions that Milgard was the killer.
Well, I didn't do it.
Milgard remains in prison, but public pressure is building to take another look at his case. In 1990, 20 years after her son's conviction, Joyce Milgard takes an unusual step. She tries to hand-deliver new evidence on the case to the Canadian Justice Minister.
I'm sorry, ma'am, if you want your son to have a fair hearing, don't approach me personally. I'm sorry.
The Canadian people were outraged when Kim Campbell, then the Minister of Justice, treated Joyce so poorly when Joyce tried to approach her to talk about her son's case.
The senior, I think he was a deputy or an assistant deputy minister, took great glee in saying that those who believe in Milgard's innocence are the same kind of people as who believe that Elvis is alive. I mean, he said that publicly. So, I mean, that's what we were dealing with.
But the question remains, if Milgard didn't kill Gail Miller, who did? Asper believes he knows.
A rapist had been working and attacking women in the vicinity where Gail Miller had been murdered. Police completely abandoned the most probable and obvious solution to the crime.
Milgard lived in Regina, a 7-hour drive away from Saskatoon. If the serial rapist and the man who murdered Miller were the same person, it couldn't be him.
Some policemen had seen a pattern in some of these unsolved rapes prior to Gail Miller's murder. And there were even rapes after her murder. And there was a pattern there. Some policemen certainly quietly talked about that.
But with no firm leads pointing at another suspect, the Milgard defense team is running out of options. Then, just as Milgard's case is losing momentum, his lawyer receives an anonymous phone call.
Bullshit.
The caller claims he knows who really killed Gail Miller, a man named Larry Fisher.
So I called Joyce up and asked her if she'd heard the name. And she said it sounded vaguely familiar. And we agreed that she would go through all the files and see if she could find the name. And then she came back with the shocking news that, yeah, he's the fellow who took the bus with Gail Miller and had been interviewed by the police.
Haven't recognized his face? No.
We got a printout of his police record, and it was quite shocking what we saw, which was the record of a very violent and repeat sexual offender.
After Milgard was convicted, Larry Fisher was arrested for another rape, and he confessed to a string of rapes in Saskatoon. Each attack was similar. At night, he'd follow women at bus stops, abduct them at knife point, and drag them into alleys. The women Fisher attacked all wore medical uniforms. The similarities to the attack on Gail Miller are chilling.
So if there's anything you could, possibly remember what happened that night.
Joyce Milgard and Paul Henderson tracked down Larry Fisher's ex-wife. What she tells them about her husband is astounding.
Where the hell were you last night?
She told us that her marriage was on the rocks,
Where the hell have you been?
that he was out every night, drinking heavily. He was abusive.
All right, I'm done. I'm leaving.
Linda, you're not going anywhere.
Henderson and Milgard ask her if she remembers anything about the morning Gail Miller was killed.
Yeah, he wasn't home that night.
Linda says that Fisher had returned while she slept.
Now, he's supposed to have gone to work that morning, but instead, here he is standing there dressed in his Sunday go-to-meeting slacks and a dress shirt. About the same time, there's a radio broadcast about the murder of Gail Miller in an alley 4 blocks from their house.
Police have reported a murder at Avenue and South this morning. Dead is 20-year-old Gail Miller of 130 Avenue O South, killed by multiple stab wounds.
She noticed that her paring knife was missing.
Probably just found that girl, didn't ya? Huh? Didn't ya? I asked him about it, but he didn't say anything.
The funny thing about it was he didn't deny it.
But Linda Fisher has even more shocking news for the Milgard team.
We lived in the basement of that same house your son visited that morning.
The same house?
It turns out that Larry Fisher and his wife rented the basement apartment in the house where Shorty Cadrain lived.
You could have knocked us over with a feather when we found out that he actually lived in the Cadrain home. It just added and added.
The Milgard team has a stunning realization. The trail of evidence that led to Shorty's house was used to implicate Milgard, but it could have just as easily pointed at Fisher. The Milgard defense team now has a credible suspect. Fisher, a violent man with a history of sexual assault, could have killed Gail Miller. Years of hard work are starting to pay off.
David, you can't give up hope.
Newspapers across Canada print stories naming Larry Fisher as a possible suspect. One of the articles has special significance for a woman who was sexually assaulted in 1969, on the morning Gail Miller was killed. The same woman who called police with a tip shortly after Miller's murder.
I always assumed that the person who had assaulted me had gone down the tracks and murdered Gail.
Until she read the article in 1991, she had assumed that her attacker was David Milgard.
When I looked at the picture, I saw this picture of David Milgard and read the article and went, oh my God, that's not the person who did the assault on me. It's that person, which was the picture of Larry Fisher. It was amazing because I started having, as I am now, those horrible flashbacks.
She had told her story to police in the days after Miller's murder. How she was groped and thrown into the snow. And how her attacker mysteriously vanished. But she had seen his face. And it wasn't David Milgard. Half an hour after the attack on her, Gail Miller was murdered.
Her physical description of her attacker was very similar to Larry Fisher, not even close to David Milgard.
Now the Milgard team has an eyewitness who puts Fiser in the area moments before Miller's death. Finally, it's enough. Mounting public pressure forces the Canadian government to take action. After 23 years spent in prison for murder, David Milgard finally gets his case re-examined by the Supreme Court of Canada.
Always maintained his innocence.
I'm here to tell the truth.
And this appearance before the
Milgard and his team are thrilled to get their case reopened, but even with all the evidence, the court wants to be sure.
The Supreme Court requested DNA from the two suspects, to which David couldn't agree fast enough.
Fiser also eventually provides a sample, but after more than 20 years, there's simply not enough DNA from the original crime scene to match either man. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court rules that David Milgard must finally be set free.
They called it a victory, even though the court rejected their argument that Milgard should be exonerated of Gail Miller's murder.
The government of Saskatchewan said that because of the lack of evidence in the case, it could not prosecute him. There was no declaration of innocence or finding of innocence or exoneration.
There's still a cloud of guilt hanging over Milgard. His defense team won't give up on trying to prove his complete innocence. They believe his salvation may come from even greater advances in DNA testing.
The technology had developed quite considerably. You know, David and Joyce were still pretty persistent in their view that let's get the test done.
After 2 years of legal wrangling, a top forensics lab near London, England, is selected to test DNA from the crime scene once again. DNA from semen on Gail Miller's clothing is found, extracted, and then matched against samples from David Milgard and Larry Fiser. The results answer a 20-year-old mystery. In 1969, police used blood typing to cast suspicion on Milgard. The new tests confirmed that Milgard and Fiser both had type A blood. But while millions of people share the same blood type, a DNA profile, like a fingerprint, is unique. When the researchers are finished, there is no doubt.
Results indicated that first, David Milgard was not the contributor to the semen on the clothing exhibits belonging to Gail Miller. Secondly, there was a high probability that Larry Fiser was the contributor of the semen.
The incredible news is immediately relayed to Milgard's lawyers.
I remember doing a jig in the street and going a bit crazy. It was news that was just overwhelming. You were thrilled, happy.
Well, it's the moment we wait for.
It's taken almost 3 decades, but David Milgard is now finally and fully cleared. He has no connection at all with the murder of Gail Miller.
I feel good. I feel very happy that's taken place.
You can't give up hope.
For Joyce Milgard, the dream of saving her son has finally come true.
The DNA testing has absolutely exonerated my son. And we've always known this all our lives.
While Milgard is cleared, the new evidence points a damning finger at Larry Fiser. His DNA is a match for the DNA found on Miller's clothing. In 1997, he goes on trial for her murder. In court, the prosecution lays out its case. Lawyers believe that Larry Fiser failed in his first attack on the morning of January 31st, 1969. Shortly after, he zeroed in on another target, Gail Miller. The court is told that Fiser had access to his uncle's car. The prosecution believes that's where Miller was raped.
In the car.
When she tried to escape, Fiser caught up with her, forced her into a nearby alley, and stabbed her to death. David Milgard happened to be nearby, searching for someone to help him with his car. While Miller was being killed, Milgard reunited with his friends, and they drove away.
Any luck?
No, you?
No. You?
No, just, just try it again, man. Maybe it's foot.
You think so?
After the murder, Fiser left a trail of evidence that led to his home. It just happened to be the same house that Milgard visited shortly after.
Probably just before Milgard got to Cadrain's home, Fiser got home from his rampage that morning. And the murder scene was only a block and a half away from where both of them were that morning.
On top of the stories of the other women who were attacked by Fiser over the years, the case against him is clear. 28 years after Gail Miller's brutal slaying, Larry Fiser is convicted of her murder.
It just made it clear what a monster he was. You know, no question in my mind that he was a full-fledged sexual psychopath.
For his 23 years spent in prison for a crime he never committed, David Milgard receives $10 million in compensation. But not everyone feels the lessons of the case have been learned.
If you convict the wrong person, it means the right person is still out there. And that's got to be an interest of society that in Canada that should lead to the adoption of the recommendations that have been made time and time and time again by our commissions of inquiry, and they're not.
Milgard endured long years in prison, but is now enjoying his return to a life that was brutally interrupted.
David is thriving. He's married to a lovely woman. They have a very young son. David is about as devoted a father as I've ever come across.
For almost 30 years, the wrong man was convicted of killing Gail Miller. For almost 30 years, the story of her life and death had the wrong ending.
As you look at it and you consider the possibility of coincidence in your life and the consequence of the coincidence, it could make you stay at home.